Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism, the show that finds anarchism, cooperation, mutual aid, non-domination in your everyday life. I'm your host, Graham Culbertson, and this is another episode in my series on David Graeber's debt. It's called Chapter 8, which is Credit versus Bullion and the Cycles of History. But since my discussion of Chapter 7 went on so long and Chapter 8 is quite short, I'm also going to cover the second half of Chapter 7. The book Debt can be divided, I would say, into three sections. And Chapter 7 to 8 is the transition between the second section and the third section. And it's also when he goes back and reviews the first two sections. So you can almost say it's divided into two halves, and we're moving into the second half. That's chapters 9 through 13. So by putting the second half of Chapter 7 and all of Chapter 8 together, essentially the first part of this episode will be a review of the first half of Debt, sections 1 and 2. And the second part of this episode will be a forecasting of Section 3, the second half of the book. Here's how Graeber summarizes this looking backward on the first two sections. The first 4 chapters of this book describe a dilemma. We don't really know how to think about debt. Or to be more accurate, we seem to be trapped between imagining society in the Adam Smith mode, as a collection of individuals whose only significant relations are with their own possessions, happily bartering one thing for another for the sake of mutual convenience, with debt almost entirely abolished from the picture. And a vision in which debt is everything, the very substance of all human relations, which of course leaves everyone with the uncomfortable sense that human relations are somehow an intrinsically tawdry business, that our very responsibilities to one another are already somehow necessarily based in sin and crime. It's not an appealing set of alternatives. All right, that's the end of the quote, and I can't remember if I've mentioned this yet, but I've been thinking it for a while. So much of this book is a series of dilemmas or puzzles. He brings up two things that we believe, but they are contradictory, or he brings up two things from the historical record that are very well supported, but seem to be paradoxical, and he says, okay, there's a mystery, and we're going to solve it. So this is the mystery. How is it that we can think of society as primordial debt? We all owe our government or the state or the land or the people everything. Or also myth of barter. Nobody owes anybody anything. And here's my very brief recap of these 4 chapters. Chapter 1, you can think of the lady at the party. He meets a lawyer, a left-wing lawyer supposedly, who hasn't heard of the IMF, and she says, surely one must pay their debts. And he thinks, well, that's not true. The way debts are done is with an assumption that you don't have to pay them back, and interest is calculated based on how likely you are to pay it back. So this is the dilemma that starts the book. How is it that we think, surely one must have to pay their debts? This is the primordial debt theory. You are guilty if you don't pay your debts. And also, oh, well, maybe the debts won't get paid. We have a bankruptcy law for that, and we can trade people's debts and barter people's subprime mortgages for other people's bullion, and it's just all a game of trading. That's the dilemma that gets the book started. Chapter 2 is the myth of barter. This is the Adam Smith-derived neoliberal fantasy in which we were once in a state of nature in which we were all murdering each other, and then we figured out that we could trade arrows for animal skins. And then, ta-da, civilization arose. The other one is the myth of primordial debt, and that's the idea that as soon as we are born, we all owe everyone. I guess our mom first, but everyone, all of society, every ancestor, the earth, God, etc., everything. And I've argued, Graeber sort of hints at this, but I think this is really important. This is the democratic socialist fantasy. And it's why in so many ways I am more sympathetic to certain capitalist fantasies in which we can all trade with one another and it will work out for everyone's mutual benefit in our trading than I'm sympathetic to some of the socialist fantasies which are like, you must work together to help everyone, otherwise you're a bad person. When I had the historian John Morrill on to talk about Cromwell, he said something like, he said to me, the quote, I don't have it exactly, it was like, you don't look like you're bearing the weight of the world the way the Marxists do, or something like that. And this, I think, although I am much more sympathetic to the socialist project, the Marxist project, the communist project, than I am the capitalist project. The reason why I try and be an anarchist communist as opposed to any of the other kinds is that I'm so tired of their dour sense of guilt and debt, which really just ruins the world. And I mean, it just makes the world not worth saving. And I think that's why you get these apostates who leave socialism, like Christopher Hitchens, who glory in the things that make life worth living because they feel like the socialists actually, in their desire to save the world, want to destroy the parts of the world that are worth having. And the people who disagree with them, Oscar Wilde is maybe the most famous example, but Kropotkin and Emma Goldman with her famous quote about dancing to the revolution, those are the socialists who I can get behind. And the myth of barter is bad and wrong, and I started this series to try and destroy the myth of barter. Along the way, Graeber convinced me we must destroy the myth of primordial debt as well. Chapter 4, which is called Cruelty and Redemption, is about how even the people who try and work against the bad forces in the world that are weighing us down with sin and debt and guilt and suffering end up using the language of debt. Most famously, Jesus, whose vision is very attractive. Graeber points out that his language is the same as that of a moneylender. He's just a reverse moneylender. I find both Jesus and Nietzsche, as I mentioned, more sympathetic in their attempt to revalue the world, but Graeber says that they are not successful, and that's why we need an alternative vision, not one that is opposed to the world of debt and guilt and sin, but one that is different from the world of debt and guilt and sin. He finds this idea in what he calls human economies, and that's what this next set of chapters is about, 5, 6, and 7. Maybe this isn't as attractive a set of alternatives as we would like, and he certainly notes there's unattractive features to all these human economies, but they are more attractive, and more importantly, there are more alternatives. Both the myth of barter and the myth of primordial debt suggest that they are the only option. And when we see human economies that are somewhat similar, but also very different from one another across different societies, we're looking at the fact that we actually have choices. And here's the quote about that. Graeber says, "This is why I developed the concept of human economies, ones in which what is considered really important about human beings is the fact that they are each a unique nexus of relations with others. Therefore, that no one could ever be considered exactly equivalent to anything or anyone else. In a human economy, money is not a way of buying or trading human beings, but a way of expressing just how much one cannot do so." Okay, so a couple of crucial things here. First, remember this is this dialectical argument he's making. The price for a murdered man, called weregild, or the price for a wife, whether someone is paying for the wife, bride price or bride wealth, or paying with the wife, dowry. He's saying that these aren't actually prices. They are acknowledgments that the price can never be paid. So rather than payments, they are IOUs, but they are IOUs in a social currency. And remember, social currencies cannot be used to buy tools or food. So they are IOUs that can never amount to anything, and that's why they are proof that payment is impossible. The other really crucial thing, and this was most of the last episode I recorded solo on chapter 7, is that slavery looks like it's hijacking these payments and making them real payments, from games to real, from pretend slavery to real slavery. But that's mostly a misdirection, Graeber think, and slavery is just the violent ripping of people out of social contexts. The price for a male slave is the same as the price of weregild, is just trapping, Graeber thinks, that obscures the fact that there actually wasn't a way to buy a person in a human economy, even though human economies were able to be pushed that direction. And then to continue the review, remember he tells us that the big tradition that we are working in is the Roman legal tradition, which contains slavery of the most odious sort, and liberalism, which is meant to undo slavery and solve the really big problems of the Roman tradition, is actually just an extension of it. Here's Graeber. "There is a direct line from the new Roman conception of liberty, not as the ability to form mutual relationships with others, but as a kind of absolute power of use and abuse over the conquered chattel, who make up the bulk of a wealthy Roman man's household, to the strange fantasies of liberal philosophers like Hobbes, Locke, and Smith about the origins of human society in some collection of 30 or 40-year-old males who seem to have sprung from the earth fully formed, then have to decide whether to kill each other or begin to swap beaver pelts. So, Graeber is saying that everything in the liberal tradition, except for men who have to choose between violence or trade, children, old people, women, sex itself, marriage, they don't exist in this state of nature. It's just murder or trade. And I think this is similar to how he discusses that Christianity is a form of primordial debt theory. It still uses the language of debt and guilt. It just wants to wipe the slate clean instead of make us owe the universe. He says that the people working within the tradition of liberalism have kept the old ideas, quote, but with the word not inserted here and there. So instead of saying you are a slave, you owe everyone, we just say you are not a slave. So what does that mean? Just the word not inserted here or there. An example he uses is Thomas Jefferson, who he calls out as, quote, the owner of many slaves. And Jefferson uses the phrase inalienable rights. In the liberal tradition, your rights are alienable. You can sell your freedom for 8 hours a day to the workplace. In Jefferson's reading, your rights are inalienable. You can't sell your freedom for 8 hours a day. But of course, a world in which the only way to eat is to sell your freedom for 8 hours a day, or 10 or 12 hours a day before the labor rights movement, declaring the rights to be inalienable doesn't help because the system is still built on those rights. And the 8-hour workday movement, which I'm calling a labor rights movement, is particularly important here because it is, as liberalism understands rights, a restriction on freedom. That's why the liberals 100 years ago hated it. Shouldn't you be allowed to sell your freedom for 10 hours a day? If you have freedom to sell yourself, the government is restricting you if you can only sell that freedom for 10 hours a day. What right does a government bureaucrat have to say that you can only alienate your freedom for 8 hours a day? All right, so this is one of my dilemmas or puzzles for you. It doesn't make sense. It seems like, according to the liberal tradition, that you actually lose freedom when the law passes forbidding people to work longer days. Even though we know in practical terms, you gain freedom to do what you want, to be with your children, your family, your friends, your lovers. And that just shows how fundamentally silly the liberal tradition is. That the way you get freedom is to lose certain rights. There's got to be a more attractive alternative. All right, that was the end of chapter 7, looking back on the previous 7 chapters. Now in chapter 8, the book restarts as a history of 5,000 years of debt. So we're going back to the beginning, and that means Mesopotamia. To set the stage for this 5,000 years miniature mega history that goes from prehistory to 2012, we've got chapter 8, Credit versus Bullion and the Cycles of History. And Graeber starts out this chapter with an absolutely astonishing claim. To sum it up, quoting Graeber, there is a shape to the past, and it is only by understanding it that we can begin to have a sense of the historical opportunities that exist in the present. All right, sounds pretty simple to me. All we need to do is understand how history works, the cycles of history, mega cycles you might say, 3 or 4 over the past 5,000 years, and then we'll understand how the world works. This is just a fantastic claim. I'm not saying it's wrong. It's unprovable. This is the creative nonfiction element that Henry Farrell ended up praising Graeber for, and I gotta say, I love it. I absolutely love it. And the scholar I'm discussing this chapter with later this month, Luke Kemp, he is someone whose work is absolutely excellent, and he does know roughly the history of the last 5, or I don't know, I'll ask Luke, 10 or 20,000 years. He goes back into the Bronze Age, and he takes Graeber's claims about debt and the cycle of history seriously, and so I can't wait to hear what he says about that. All right, now, I gave you this This way to understand Graeber, there's a puzzle in history, and, there's a mystery, and Sherlock Graeber is on the case. The first puzzle that he starts off with in chapter 8 is slavery was abolished roughly around the year 600 AD in the post-Roman world, and it wasn't recreated for about 1,000 more years in the European Mediterranean world. That's the racist enslavement of Africans that we are all so familiar with. But the clue, the mystery, is that this rough timeline happened other places. Graeber says, the demise of ancient slavery was not limited to Europe. Remarkably, right around the same time, in the years around 600 AD, we find almost exactly the same thing happening in India and China, where over the course of centuries, amidst much unrest and confusion, chattel slavery largely ceased to exist. What all this suggests is that moments of historical opportunity, moments when meaningful change is possible, follow a distinct, even a cyclical pattern, one that has long been far more coordinated across geographical space than we would ever have imagined. This is just a wild claim. You can clearly see that this book was written during the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street era. As we'll see, the argument goes that when Nixon took the world economy off the gold standard, that showed that we were entering a new cycle of history and the possibility for change opened up. Because world history has cycles. That's the mystery that needs to be solved. And the answer is bullion. That's right. Changes in gold bullion, according to David Graeber, is how you see how these cycles worked. And again, I'm not saying this is wrong. I can't wait to ask Luke Kemp what he thinks. I, in fact, love it. He is clearly writing in his era and from his era's concerns, and everyone does this. It's just that some people, and these are the great essayists, Montaigne and Didion, Emerson, Cavell, Marker, Varda, these essayists admit they are writing from their own world, their own life, their own body, and their own concerns. The people who get it wrong are the people who pretend you can write from some sort of accountant's version of truth. Graeber is self-consciously fashioning a usable past for the age of debt unrest in the 21st century. And honestly, I think a lot of what he predicted became true during the pandemic. So as a work of creative nonfiction, I think this is fucking great. History, at least the history of Afro-Eurasia, as Eleanor Janega taught me to call it, the world from the Straits of Gibraltar all the way to Japan, looks roughly the same way everywhere, according to Graeber, and we can see the arc of history if we know to look for the money. The easiest way to make these cycles visible is to re-examine exactly the phenomenon we've been concerned with over the course of this book. The history of money, debt, and credit. The moment we begin to map the history of money across the last 5,000 years of Eurasian history, startling patterns begin to emerge. In the case of money, one event stands out above all others: the invention of coinage. Coinage appears to have arisen independently in 3 different places, almost simultaneously. On the Great Plain of northern China, in the Ganges River Valley of northeast India, and in the lands surrounding the Aegean Sea, in each case between roughly 600 and 500 BC. This wasn't due to some sudden technological innovation. The technologies used in making the first coins were, in each case, entirely different. It was a social transformation. All right, so Graeber is saying that roughly 2,500 years ago, halfway through his 5,000-year arc, coinage showed up. It seems to have been invented independently in these 3 different places that now roughly match India, China, and Europe. But it wasn't a technological thing. It was social and economic forces operating in this mega historical unit we call, civilization, that created the conditions for coinage. Back to Graeber. If we look at Eurasian history over the course of the last 5,000 years, what we see is a broad alternation between periods dominated by credit money and periods in which gold and silver come to dominate. That is, those during which at least a large share of transactions were conducted with pieces of valuable metal being passed from hand to hand. Me breaking in, again, this is one of his puzzles, and again, here's the answer: war. The single most important factor would appear to be war. Bullion predominates above all in periods of generalized violence. There's a very simple reason for that. Gold and silver coins are distinguished from credit arrangements by one spectacular feature. They can be stolen. A debt is, by definition, a record as well as a relation of trust. Someone accepting gold or silver in exchange for merchandise, on the other hand, need trust nothing more than the accuracy of the scales, the quality of the metal, and the likelihood that someone else will be willing to accept it. In a world where war and the threat of violence are everywhere, and this appears to be an equally accurate description of warring states China, Iron Age Greece, and pre-Mauryan India, there are obvious advantages to making one's transactions simple. All right, so that's the end of the Graeber quote. Now we've got the explanation of what happened in these three places. In BC 600, war was beginning, and violence, which is the villain of this entire book, or more specifically, coercive violence, is the reason why. If you're not afraid that someone is going to come after you with a sword, you are willing to make all sorts of deals based on trust. If you believe in the system, whether or not you actually like that system, you can have mostly credit money. But if someone can break the deal at any moment by using violence to cut through this social or human economy, you better make sure you get paid in cold, hard cash. That's a phrase we still use, even though in the United States, cash is almost never cold and hard these days. Graeber elaborates. For much of human history, then, an ingot of gold or silver, stamped or not, has served the same role as the contemporary drug dealer's suitcase full of unmarked bills, an object without a history, valuable because one knows it will be accepted in exchange for other goods just about anywhere, no questions asked. As a result, while credit systems tend to dominate in periods of relative social peace or across networks of trust, whether created by states or in most periods, transnational institutions like merchant guilds or communities of faith, in periods characterized by widespread war and plunder, they tend to be replaced by precious metal. What's more, while predatory lending goes on in every period of human history, the resulting debt crises appear to have the most damaging effects at times when money is most easily convertible to cash. All right, into the quote, a few important things. First, although states like to say they create money, it's merchants working together almost anarchistically that create credit networks. Merchants or faith communities, which in the Islamic tradition and the Buddhist tradition are surprisingly similar things. In the present day, Bill Maurer talked about research into this, like the Visa card network originally began as a sort of mutual aid network for rich people. This is another reason why I don't love everything about the MMT way of understanding things, because they're so focused on the state. Moving on from that, Graeber is also making the argument that when money is done based on credit, money becomes part of these rich social contexts. Credit arrangements are somewhere in between a full money economy and the human economies he wrote about, for example, in the Lele. So when something goes wrong in a debt crisis, everyone can just sort of talk it out and make it work if there's a human economy behind the money economy. But when it becomes really impersonal and everything can be easily converted into cash, a debt crisis becomes a full-blown crisis. People starve because there's no social buffer around economics. So this is the reading, that violence creates coin-based economies and that coin-based economies eventually crash into greater violence before finally being reconstituted into more credit-based and socially rich economies before there is another crash. And Graeber reads all of the last 5,000 years history of the world. Again, from the Straits of Gibraltar, where Spain almost touches Morocco, to the coast of Japan. All of this Afro-Eurasian civilization is the story of these cycles. This cycle of government theory has existed at least since Plato explained that aristocracy would become oligarchy, then democracy, then tyranny, then back to aristocracy. But I've never seen it applied to hundreds of millions of people over 5,000 years. Plato was talking about, individual cities and a few generations. Here's some more Graeber. As a starting point to any attempt to discern the great rhythms that define the current historical moment, let me propose the following breakdown of Eurasian history according to the alternation between periods of virtual and metal money. The cycle begins with the age of the first agrarian empires, 3500 to 800 BC, dominated by virtual credit money. This is followed by the axial age, 800 BC to 600 AD, which will be covered in the next chapter, and which saw the rise of coinage and a general shift to metal bullion. The Middle Ages, 600 to 1450 AD, which saw a return to virtual credit money, will be covered in Chapter 10. Chapter 11 will cover the next turn of the cycle, the age of capitalist empires, which began around 1450 with a massive planetary switch back to gold and silver bullion, and which could only really be said to have ended in 1971 when Richard Nixon announced that the US dollar would no longer be redeemable in gold. This marked the beginning of yet another phase of virtual money, one which has only just begun and whose ultimate contours are necessarily invisible. Chapter 12, the final chapter, will be devoted to applying the insights of history to understand what it might mean and the opportunities it might throw open. All right, so Graeber is saying, I think that when other people have tried to study money, one of the reasons why they have failed, besides the fact, as listener Brendan pointed out, that money was never really invented, we've always had the idea, is people have tried to figure out which one of these things it is. Is it a statement of credit arrangements, or is it a statement of sovereignty? And the fact of the matter is, Graeber's saying it has always been both, kind of, but it's also been alternating which one it mostly is, whether it's a unit of value or a unit of social relationships, just keeps changing. So if someone sets out to study the history of money, it's going to look contradictory if they don't understand that it's actually a cycle. So earlier we could say, if someone said, what is money? Is it something simply used to trade, or is it something that marks our social relationships? The answer is, well, it's both. But the short answer is it's both. The longer answer is, I don't know. Is it 1000 AD or 1000 BC? Because depending on where you are in the great arc of history tells me how I should answer your question. All right. Now, we've already gotten a certain amount of history about these 3500 to 800 BC agrarian empires, and I think that's why Graeber doesn't spend much time on them. We started in ancient Mesopotamia, and we've returned to it many times. The really important thing for this book is that Graeber thinks we are at the dawn of a new age, one in which we can imagine a whole new way of thinking about social credit. Maybe this sounds ridiculous to you, but Graeber has convinced me, and that's why I've embraced UBI so hard versus a jobs guarantee, because UBI seems so much more liberatory. I do want to grab in this episode just a couple of bits from these first agrarian empires to give you a little flavor of it. First, there's one about King Inmetena of Lagash in 2402 BC. Lagash is in Mesopotamia, and King Inmetena is threatening a rival who has appropriated too much of his land. Here's Graeber. Usury, in the sense of interest-bearing consumer loans, was also well established by Inmetena's time. The king ultimately had his war. This is me breaking in. He was threatening this rival. Okay. And won it. And 2 years later, fresh off his victory, he was forced to publish another edict. This one, a general debt cancellation within his kingdom. As he later boasted, quote, he instituted freedom, or amargi, in Lagash. He restored the child to its mother and the mother to her children. He canceled all interest due. So this is the end of the quote from Inmetena, and back to Graeber's reading of Inmetena's decree. This was, in fact, the very first such declaration we have on record, and the first time in history that the word freedom appears in a political document. All right, back to me. So this goes back to the very beginning of the book. We're in Mesopotamia. What is freedom? It's not any sort of positive conception of what you are able to do. It's just freedom from debt. This is the 5,000 years bit again. Whatever existed before debt may or may not have been freedom. Kropotkin thought it was an anarchist communist utopia. Graeber doesn't say that anywhere. But once you have systematic debt, the closest thing you can get to freedom is the cancellation of debt, but then the debts will build back up, and you've got the cycle of history. These are miniature cycles within these mega cycles, Graeber says. Back to Graeber. In Matena's text is a bit vague on the details, but a half-century later, when his successor Oruanamingina declared a general amnesty during the New Year's ceremonies of 2350 BC, the terms are all spelled out, and they conform to what has become typical of such amnesties, canceling not only all outstanding loans, but all forms of debt servitude, even those based on failure to pay fees or criminal penalties, the only thing accepted being commercial loans. Similar declarations are to be found again and again in Sumerian and later Babylonian and Assyrian records, and always with the same theme, the restoration of justice and equity, the protection of widows and orphans, to ensure, as Hammurabi was to put it when he abolished debts in Babylon in 1761 BC, quote, that the strong might not oppress the weak. End of Hammurabi's quote, finishing Graeber's quote now. Over the next several thousand years, this same list, canceling the debts, destroying the records, reallocating the land, was to become the standard list of demands of peasant revolutionaries everywhere. In Mesopotamia, rulers appear to have headed off the possibility of unrest by instituting such reforms themselves. All right, so this is the cycle of history up until the axial age of roughly 3,000 years ago. From 2500 BC to 800 BC, the wealthy and the powerful took what they could, which meant enslavement. But the peasants could always head to the hills. This sounds a lot like James C. Scott's concept in The Art of Not Being Governed. Graeber says the farmers could, quote, defect to swell the ranks of nomadic pastoralists, and ultimately, if the breakdown continued, return to overrun the cities and destroy the existing economic order entirely. All right, that's the end of that little miniature quote. So if these people who were practicing the art of not being governed got big and strong enough in the mountains, they would come down and destroy the economic system. So to forestall this, monarchs from Inmatena on down would cancel everything, start over, clean the slate. And for a little comic anecdote of how important this is, the famous Rosetta Stone, which we only consider important because it helped us translate hieroglyphics, was originally raised to announce an amnesty both for debtors and for prisoners, declared by Ptolemy V in 196 BC. When I read that quote in Graeber, I couldn't believe it. I've seen the Rosetta Stone. I thought it was significant because it taught us about hieroglyphics, but it should also have taught me how important debt is. Now, Graeber provides examples of these traditions: agrarian empires with temple bureaucracies, which provide security and control, leading to slavery, which leads to unrest, and the cancellation of debts and a clean slate, leading to the cycle starting over again, in Egypt and China, as well as Mesopotamia. And I want to be very clear, he says that it happens slightly differently in each of the three places. It's not identical. He's not saying everything is exactly the same, but he is saying that in the broad strokes, this is the same story, this cycle, for thousands of years, until that cycle gets interrupted by the mega cycle change, which is the axial age, which we will talk about on the next episode. Remember, you can always email me at everydayanarchismpodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Reviews of the show on Spotify or Apple help a lot. You can go to everydayanarchism.com and donate to the show. That helps too. Thanks again to my volunteer editors. You guys have been a huge help. And the music, which you are about to hear, is by David Hill.